lots of fuzz to me.
Thanks everybody for coming. So today's session is titled, What Did Joseph Campbell Get Wrong? This is the first installment of a three-part series on folkloristics and what folklorists can teach us about narrative genre and how that informs just our reading of this type of work in the world. Joseph Campbell is a really meaningful figure to a lot of people. A lot of people really love his work and cite him often. His name is kind of synonymous with mythology generally. If you say mythology, people are going to be like, oh, like Joseph Campbell said, right? So he's seen as an authority. He's kind of a ubiquitous reference. Sort of on a popular level among a general audience, he's really perceived to be the guy who knows what he's talking about, the guy who has the right take. And for that reason, I feel like it's important to engage with his work, especially because there are important problems with his work. So first, let's talk about the model itself. Let's start with what his main theory is. This term monomyth, Joseph Campbell didn't actually coin that term. That was James Joyce, as far as I understand. But it's the idea that there are this sort of repeatable motifs that appear in stories throughout the world, throughout time. And you can look at this recurring story in these different cultures, and it's kind of uncanny. It's like, why is the same story showing up in all of these places? It's really interesting, right? The hero's journey operates on this cycle where you start out at the top with the ordinary world. The hero's just kind of going about his regular life. And then he gets a call to adventure, okay, that interrupts his routine and sort of spurs him out of his comfort zone. Then we get the refusal of the call, where he resists, he's hesitant, he's reluctant for any number of reasons. He meets a mentor, that's the helper on this diagram, who gives him some guidance, encourages him to cross the threshold of adventure, which can involve any of these inciting events. He enters, after crossing the threshold of adventure, he enters this kind of new world, the world of adventure, and he proceeds to encounter and overcome tests and enemies. He encounters allies, other helpers. It's sort of like the complexities of the adventure begin to unfold. Then he approaches the innermost cave, where he sort of goes inward, he prepares for his great ordeal, and then he engages in this ordeal, which is sort of like a test of his resolve. And he engages in a sort of transformative experience. He achieves something of great value, an achievement, an object. He makes the decision to return. He starts on the road home. And then there's sort of a final test as he's crossing back from across the threshold of adventure back to regular life. It's like a final ordeal. So this might be a resurrection, or this might be, something severe. And then he comes home and he brings the elixir home. The elixir is the thing of great value. So this is the essential story. Like I said, this story in pop culture, this framework is perceived to be universal, spanning all cultures and times. It's perceived to be authoritative. So I was just looking at some articles about it this morning, and these are direct quotes from its presentation on like a film website. This is called A Timeless Blueprint that represents all cultures and eras, from ancient myths to modern blockbusters. And it is not just one possible storyline, but it's presented as a storyline that is deeply rooted in the collective psyche. Like, this is deep down what stories are. This is deep down what humans do with hero stories. They follow this model. It's almost on accident, like whether they want to or not. It kind of just bubbles up. It comes out of us. So it's not just something that exists here and there. It's something that says something about who and what we are as humans deep down. Okay. This is also prescriptive. So this is a model that storytellers use, writers use, to say, like, how should I be writing a story? If you're writing a screenplay, you're going to come across the hero's journey at some point, and you're probably going to be encouraged to look for ways to incorporate the hero's journey into the story that you're writing. It's also held up as prescriptive for how we can make meaning of stories. We're sort of generally invited to think about the hero's journey as a personal framework that you can use to understand your own personal journey and as a way to understand myths and sort of find relevance in them today. The problem is it's full of problems. So what we're going to do is sort of zoom through several major flaws in this model, okay? So the first major problem is that it is a total flattening of stories. Like, by calling it universal to all times and places, what you're doing is you're flattening the differences. You're ignoring the differences between all of these different times and places in order to find the pattern, okay? Sometimes it's fine to overlook differences to see a larger pattern, but you need cultural specificity to fully understand a story. What's on screen here is an image from Middle America. We have a bird's eye view of the city of Tokyo, and we have a presentation being given by some native folks in a formal way. Even if, let's just imagine that there is a storyline that can be found from each of these different contexts, a storyline in which, somebody sets out and encounters a thing and comes back and brings home a revelation or something. You can just imagine how differently that story would take shape in urban Tokyo and rural America and in a native storytelling context, right? It would be very different. It would have different cultural markers. It would have different cultural meanings. You can imagine like what kind of color that they would carry within those contexts. So Joseph Campbell has a background in comparative literature. I love the study of literature. My background, I studied literature in undergrad, and then I studied anthropology in my master's program. And as a person who engaged in literary criticism and literary studies, comparative literature is wonderful. I think it's really valuable and deep. And that's one of the frameworks that Joseph Campbell is drawing on, is this. He's looking at myth as literature, and he's noticing these patterns. However, these are not just literary stories, they're cultural stories. And when you're dealing with culture, you have to get culturally specific. Like I said, Joseph Campbell's whole project was to zoom out and see things from a great distance and sort of notice patterns. Isn't it interesting how the same thing is sort of happening in these different contexts? And yeah, that comparative process is really interesting. But if that's all you do, if that's the main thing you do, if you start to equate this story and that story and this story and that story, you start to engage in some pretty serious cultural flattening, which is not great. When I was in my grad program, my thesis involved study of native ethnographic myth texts that were gathered in the colonial transition here in Oregon, in the Kalapuya area. And so I was leaning on the guidance of a Kalapuya anthropologist at Oregon State who was helping to frame and point me in the right direction, right? And a story that he told about the need for cultural specificity. He said, there's a place called Cascadia Caves near South Santiam. It's east of Sweet Home. There's this outcropping of rocks that settlers had been visiting, and early anthropologists were aware that there were petroglyphs there that were several thousand years old. Okay, these images on rock. They looked at the petroglyphs, thought they were really interesting, made suppositions about what they might mean. And their theory was they interpreted them as having to do with bears. This is a bear power place. This is a place where the spirit of the bear is powerful. So time passed. Following the 1970s, other people came in, they studied the place, they worked to restore it, and at some point, tribal experts were consulted, and they were like, it's not a bear power place, it's a fishing site. The images depicted salmon. And so the local place-specific perspective of people from the culture is essential to the interpretation of the story. You can see a thing and completely misunderstand it. If we're seeing this story and noticing that it has a lot in common with this story, cool, that's interesting. But if we're only ever dealing with it at that level, there's a chance that we might be really missing some important nuance, some important meaning, if we're conflating the two and we're like, look, all these people are telling the same story. There's no wrong way to look at stories, right? You can adopt any lens, you can find value looking at things in any way. But even when you're dealing with literature as literature, you still need to bear the cultural perspective in mind in order to understand its intent, at least. So for my thesis, I leaned on the guidance of the anthropologist I mentioned, whose name is David Lewis, and I also spoke with another Coos storyteller and language teacher, Patty Warrett Phillips, who's out on the coast. And as I went through these native myth texts, I often consulted them and said, here's the pattern I'm seeing in these stories. Here's something that I think I see as interesting. Do you think I'm on the right track? How, am I? And, and they would say, yeah, that's an interesting pattern, but I think this is more important. Or they would say, well, here's the thing you're not taking into account. Or here's a backstory that you don't know. Or here's the thing that's culturally really important that would have been the focus of this kind of story. Working with those tradition bearers, with those cultural stewards, to make sure that I was understanding the stories, not just imposing my assumptions upon them, right? So flattening is not great. It skews the reality of the story, of what its intended cultural meaning is, and you could also say it harms people, right? There is a dominant perspective that sort of replicates itself, and it's a sort of prioritizing one perspective, one way of seeing things, and as long as you're always defaulting to one way of seeing things, you're always kind of flattening things into the same shape, you're going to miss a lot of voices, you're going to miss a lot of perspectives. You're really erasing the specific, vibrant identities of all of these people who would disagree with you about your interpretation about their heritage, right? So flattening is not great. The other thing that Joseph Campbell really leans into is stereotypes. So my first introduction to Joseph Campbell was in 2007. I was staying with a friend. One evening they had on this documentary about Joseph Campbell and his work. And, I'm listening to this documentary and thinking, he's talking about mythology. I'm really into this. This is cool. He's talking about how, the young man, the hero, has to go out and he has to, encounter obstacles, and he has to overcome. He has to have a test of will. He has to have, a visionary experience and then come back with this knowledge and value. And then he takes a moment to pivot, and he's like, okay, so this is about men. So what does it look like for women? And the reason I chose this picture of a woman sitting outside of a circular hut is because his view of what the woman's journey is to sit inside the hut. Women have the answers within themselves. They don't actually need to experience this type of journey. The womb and pregnancy and regeneration and rebirth, they become pregnant and they carry life and they generate life. They have that already within them. They don't have to go out and seek things outside of themselves. So, all they really need to do is the ritual for a woman is really just to go inside the hut and meditate and really understand the source. Right?
Hasn't heard of Amazon.
Right. There's so many stories that belie this, right? It was that moment, by the way, in 2007 that I was like, I hate this guy and I want to take him down. So I've been sort of irritable about Joseph Campbell ever since.
Your personal quest.
Exactly. Yes. My journey to fight Joseph Campbell.
Hasn't met you as a woman hero.
So, and then if you look at how women are presented throughout his work, often it's just a reiteration of stereotypes, right? It's like they either don't have agency, or if they do have agency, they're kind of evil and need to be like the temptress, they need to be overcome. And hopefully we can all agree that is a dated, limiting concept that is kind of dumb, that we need to move beyond. His social views are really outdated when it comes to he was writing from the 40s. He was talking about primitive man. He was, he uses dated language calling societies and cultures primitive. Okay. But he's also going beyond just the use of dated language. He's also sort of reducing, he was exoticizing the idea of the medicine man and speculating on all these things without really having any kind of ethnographic knowledge of these people. He's seeing from a very specific vantage point, and he's not taking into account the full humanity of indigenous people. He's not taking into account the full humanity of women generally. He's really sort of replicating and reproducing these stereotypes. Why is this bad? Well, again, it skews reality. If you're not understanding the full humanity of women or of non-Western people, and the intersections of those categories, plus other categories I haven't mentioned, like disabled people, there's a lot of people that he isn't reckoning with, that he isn't really listening to or representing. And as long as you are sort of ignoring vast swaths of the population, you're kind of creating a skewed vision. Like when you're saying, like, this is what human stories are, but you're not representing the whole. That's not great, and it also reinforces social harms. Reality is much more interesting and complex than the image that we get from the hero's journey. And like, I'm all for having one model that can really precisely bring out one particular type of insight, but the difference is that this is put forth as the model. This is put forth as the universal model that kind of sums it all up. And it really doesn't. There are many deficits in this view of things, so that's not great. All right, now we move on. So what else is wrong? Well, the next problem with Joseph Campbell's work is the cherry picking. Models should be made to fit the data, not the other way around. That's true in any kind of science or any kind of research. If you are working really hard to bend the data into your system, you're doing it wrong. If you have to work really hard to get the data to cooperate with your model, then you have a bad model. So responsible research is letting the data, the real world, inform and guide your conclusions. Essentially, if you have to boil it down, it's that Joseph Campbell is not basing his conclusions on responsible research. So what he's doing, first of all, is he's ignoring all of the stories that don't fit. There are a lot of cultures in the world. There are a lot of times and places. And if there's one thing that I have learned from the study of anthropology, it's that there are a lot of different ways to be human. So to say that this is sort of a human universal, it's true in all times and places, like, first off, like, anytime anybody says that, I'm like that raises a red flag to me, because, is it? It's such a broad statement, and it's so unsupported. Pretty much any generalization you want to make about people, there's probably a culture in which that hasn't been the case. We are remarkably creative species in how we choose to live and go about our lives. So just right out of the gate, there are plenty of stories that just don't fit this model. There are many that just don't. And so those don't come up in the hero's journey. The hero with 1,000 faces doesn't deal with those at all. But then even within the stories that he cites as examples of the narrative, he has to dramatically reinterpret them in order to make them fit, or just ignore them altogether. So, like, for example, in the Belly of the Whale chapter, Campbell, the thesis of that chapter is that there's all these stories about people being eaten or subsumed, and then they have this kind of transformation, and then they come out and they've been reborn, right? And we can see, like Belly of the Whale, we can see Jonah in this, right? He didn't want to go to Nineveh. He got swallowed by the whale. He had a change of heart. He got spit out on the beach. He went and he did his prophesying, and that's, that was sort of a transformational experience for him. Great, cool for Jonah.
And then he got angry when it happened.
Yeah, sure.
He didn't want it to happen.
That's right. Yeah. He was resistant.
Hero gets pissy.
Yeah, he did. Yes, that's part of the circle. So then Joseph Campbell, to make this point, he cites 5 other stories. Okay, there's one, Finn McCool swallowed by a creature of some sort. Little Red Riding Hood was eaten by the wolf. Maui was swallowed by a figure in his mythology. Zeus's siblings were swallowed by Kronos. And then you have Heracles, who dove into a monstrous mouth and cut his way out. The problem with these stories that he presents is that they don't actually prove his point. It's like he makes a point, he says, you get swallowed, you have an epiphany, you get reborn. And then he's like, look at all these other stories where somebody gets swallowed. But the thing is, who's getting transformed here? It's like Little Red Riding Hood, when she got eaten by the wolf, she didn't have an epiphany. She was just eaten. And then, thank goodness, the woodcutter came along and cut her free, right? And then she was like, whoa, she and Grandma got out. And, like, that wasn't like an ordeal, she wasn't reborn in that way. Maui, when he was swallowed by his creature, he died. He just died. And then Zeus's siblings, who were swallowed by Kronos, they stayed inside of Kronos for a good long while, and then they were eventually cut free, and then they went on about their lives. But they weren't experiencing like an epiphany or a transformation. these are just stories. The thing these stories have in common is somebody got eaten. That's not necessarily like proof of the overarching point that Campbell is trying to make, that like we have these sort of like go into the cave, be remade, come back out, be better, be wiser. So even within the evidence that he presents to support his theory, it's lacking. He also makes really broad statements. Here's a quote. He says, "Ancient cities are built like temples, having their portals to the four directions, while in the central place stands the major shrine of the divine city founder." Maybe that's true for some cities, but when you say ancient cities, like, what are you talking about? Like, are you talking about ancient cities in one continent or another continent? Which country? Which valley? Which, what do you mean by ancient even? Are you saying like 2,000 years ago? Or are you saying 8,000 years ago? There's been a lot of times and places in the world, and I can guarantee you that not all cities are built on the same city plan. So it comes back again to this sort of specificity problem. Just kind of putting forth these really broad statements that are not supported either by any argument of his or by the world itself, right? The last thing I will say about this is that if you make your theory so broad, if you make a really broad catch-all statement that cannot be disproven, it's like, well, okay, congratulations, you've made a theory that holds up, but it's essentially a meaningless theory because it fits everything, So like, for example, in this call to adventure, is crossing a threshold really the same as battling one's brother? Is that really the same as battling a dragon? Is that really the same as getting crucified? Is that the same as taking a night sea journey? These are dramatically different events. And to put them all in the same category, to say, well, they're all a call to adventure. And it's like, okay, well, they're all inciting incidents, I guess. Like, a story has to kind of start somewhere. A story typically has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But do these things really have anything in common with each other? Okay, well, what about when I went to the grocery store? I got in my car and I started the engine. And he's like, you got in your car. That was the call to adventure. They're like, that's not the same as being crucified. So it starts to lose meaning, right? When you say, I've got this theory in which a thing happens, and then you're like, well, hold on, what about this story where that thing didn't happen? And you're like, oh, no, the thing that did happen in that story is an example of the thing I'm saying. That's not really enough to build a theory on, in my opinion. That's like just a really broad catch-all statement that can't be falsified. So why is cherry picking a problem? It's just sloppy thinking. And it's also a missed opportunity to listen to what's actually out there, to what the stories are actually saying, and to people who are actually attempting to understand and interpret the stories for others. There are so many fascinating things about these stories that you really don't get a chance to experience as long as you're sort of superimposing this kind of simplistic pattern onto them, okay? This leads us to our fourth and final problem. I mentioned that Joseph Campbell has his roots in comparative literature. He's also drawing heavily from psychoanalysis. Carl Jung, Sigmund Freud, right? First off, psychoanalysis is interesting, but Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud are not psychologists by today's standards, by any means. They are still considered sort of founders of psychology. They have some very interesting ideas that are worth pondering, but they are not doing science in the way that psychologists today are doing science. Freud at one point was like, I don't even think that my theories can or should be tested because it's enough that I think they're true and that I see them in the people who come through my door. So like, they're not trying to look systematically at the world and understand what they're seeing, like based on, they're not doing research in that way, right? They are not making falsifiable statements. They're writing something much more like philosophy than present-day psychology, right? And then even if you're looking at mythology through the lens of present-day psychology, I would say that psychology is not actually the best discipline for understanding mythology. Psychology is not primarily a discipline that is dedicated to the study of myth, although fascinatingly, when myth comes up, it's almost always talked about in a psychological way. looking for like what psychological insights can it yield. You can look at mythology through that lens. And again, as a good literary student, I'm not going to say that any lens is essentially not a good idea to look through. Look through all the lenses. But it limits the set of questions you're able to ask. You're looking at mythology as information about the mind, information about the self and like the interior world. All of that is great. I'm not like disparaging any of these things, but it misses a lot. So meanwhile, we have these whole other disciplines that are dedicated to the study of these kinds of stories. And they have just a completely different set of training and premises that they use to engage in these stories. And I'll give a couple examples. So right here we have a picture of somebody sitting at an oral history table interviewing a community member. Oral history it's a whole field. There are rules for how to do it right. There are considerations, there are like ethics to it. It's, the same goes for archaeology, the same goes for ethnography, folklore, history, like all of these things. There are these disciplines that have been doing this work in a really systematic way. Again, it's like there's so much more to be found here through these other lenses of, say, history and anthropology and folklore. So the lady here on the left, her name is Jan Bender-Shetler. She is an Africanist. She's a historian of Africa. And she studies a time and place where there are no written records, the Serengeti before colonial contact. And so how do you do that? She also, I will say, is doing a really uncommon feat in the world of history by writing what's called the longue durée. So in history, typically when you find a responsible history written by a professional historian, you'll see a title such as The Emergence of Topic X during the years 1820 to 1860. Really tightly bounded study, like 40 years or 60 years, or maybe 120 years, or maybe just 5 years, maybe just 1 year. Historians look at really tightly bounded questions because to do more than that is so complex. Like they have to go so exhaustively into the archive, and you can't exhaustively read all of the archives to do a history of 1,000 years, unless that's your life's work, and you spend your entire career building up to that. And that type of history is called the longue durée, the long duration, like these hundreds of thousands of years narratives. And it's a rare thing for a historian to do responsibly, and this is what Shetler is doing. And she's doing it in Africa where they don't have written records before the colonial era. So how is she doing this work? She's listening to myths, culturally interpreted by people in the communities. She's having long conversations with them. She's talking with archaeologists. She's doing this multidisciplinary thing. She analyzes them historically and tries to derive big picture, long scale events from those things. And she introduced two words to my lexicon, or two phrases that I often go back to as profound: core spatial images and generative principles. So you can look at a story and you can look at how it represents space. There's a mountain, there's a field. You can understand certain things in deep time about the way that they're presenting these sort of spatial images, and then generative principles. Our society started when these two people, one from the mountain, one from the field, came together and ... That right there could be like a cultural memory of a whole, like a migration event. That is of deeply historical significance, and you can build a history on those principles of how those peoples came to be, or of how that region changed over time. An example from our region is, I think I might have told this story in one of my previous presentations, but during the end of the last ice age, when we had these gigantic floods coming in from the glacial lakes up in Canada and further north, you had those ice dams breaking, you had huge, just incomprehensibly huge amounts of water carving out the gorge and rushing out to the ocean. You had the Willamette Valley, a 400-foot deep lake. And so in the stories, what you have is, in the native stories, you have flood stories where they're like, the water came, everybody got in their canoes, everybody was lifted up as high as the old growth, tippy top of the old growth trees. If you had rope, good for you. You could tie your rope onto a tree and stay there. And if you didn't have rope, whoops, you drifted off to who knows where. You went out and maybe started a different civilization, or maybe died. I don't know. But the people who had the rope and they tied their canoes to the trees, they stayed here. Now, you could say, oh, that's a flood story, just like the flood story in the Bible. Yeah, they're both flood stories, but they're talking about really different events with really different meaning. So that's just an example of how those kind of historical specific events can be found in myths, which is really great. And historians are working on that, especially in places like Africa, where other options for doing history just don't exist. Again, listening for those deep patterns, working with people from that culture to contextualize and reinterpret and collaboratively interpret that. That's really powerful, beautiful work. And that's something that's just in its own universe compared to what we've been talking about to this point. Okay, now this guy. This is the other thing, and I'll be much more brief about him, but his name is Arnold van Gennep, if I'm saying that correctly. He is an anthropologist, and he came up with a model to describe rites of passage, common rites of passage in societies. He lived from 1873 to 1957, so before Campbell, and he came up with something that looks like this. Interesting. You start at the top, a sense of stable identity that then goes down into a period of separation, and you enter sort of this liminal in-between state where, there's a lot that's going on, a lot that's changing, and then you work your way back, you return, you come up back to stability. So well before Joseph Campbell made up the hero's journey, there were anthropologists who had noticed that this was a pattern that can be found in rites of passage. It turns out the hero's journey is not actually very original to begin with. This is a diagram that is, I came across very similar diagrams during my graduate studies, and they're not talking about a literary structure. And it's not just about heroes. This is about any rite of passage. Let's talk about marriage. Here you are, you're a young person, you live in your community as an individual, and then you separate. Maybe it's a norm in your culture to go and spend some time alone with your betrothed for a period of time. You sort of enter this liminal space. Are you still the same person? Are you not? I don't know. You're changing. You come back to your community. Now you're a married person with a different set of rights and responsibilities according to your culture and how that community views this transition, right? Marriage is one. Puberty is one, death is one, birth is one. This happens at these moments of life when your identity is changing. Things have been one way, and then they shift, and then they are a different way. And again, this isn't necessarily like a human universal. I'm not saying that every social or cultural transition follows this pattern, but this is something that is a valid observation about the way that a lot of people in a lot of cultures experience change. And it predates the hero's journey, right? So Joseph Campbell is taking something that is real and true and maybe overextending it to suggest that, all heroes are always following this particular pattern, or that, that it can be found in the ways that he thinks it can be. So it's not to say that the model is a bad model. It's to say, A, Campbell didn't invent it, and B, he's sort of misapplying it. Just to circle back to missing context, why is it bad? We don't want to base our ideas on pseudoscience. We don't want to miss opportunities to learn from these other disciplines that's so much deeper and more nuanced and more solid than what Joseph Campbell was offering to the world. People who have dedicated their careers to understanding these kinds of stories and the things they've learned along the way, the things they've ruled out, the things they've picked up and refined, you're just not getting the benefit of all of that perspective. So, to bring us home, what I will say is there's a better way to do this. I want to share with you a quote about folklore. This is from the Harvard website of their undergraduate folklore program, and they talk about what are the skills that a folklore student is going to learn there in their program. And I love this. I love this list. It goes, the essential skills: deep listening, observant participation, cross-cultural comparison, historical contextualization, collaborative interpretation, cultural documentation, empathetic engagement, and good storytelling. All of these things are core to what folklorists do. And, and that's sort of a hint at how we could be engaging with these stories differently, right? Deep listening, taking the stories on their own terms. Observant participation, understanding how those stories are continually performed and renewed and transmitted to others. This goes to the heart of what a good ethnographer or a good folklorist is going to do. I want to highlight the collaborative interpretation piece. A folklorist is going to go and say, share your stories. I'd love to hear your stories. And they're going to say, instead of, oh yeah, that means this. I know that means this. They're going to say, what does that mean? What does that mean to you? Tell me about what that means. They're going to be listening deeply, not just. They're going to be trying to listen beyond their own perspective. They're going to be trying to listen to not only the words that are spoken, but the silences that they hear as well. What's being said, what's not being said. They're going to, cross-cultural comparison is really fun and interesting, but they're going to contextualize that with history and culture and specificity. To me, that's where it's at. So, rather than engaging with myth stories as a way primarily to describe our own minds in an individualistic way, and using it as a inspiration for psychoanalysis, which again, I truly am not against that. If that's something that's personally meaningful, I think it's fine to do. But rather than letting it end there, rather than stopping with that, and certainly rather than basing our conclusions on irresponsible research, we can take these myths on their own terms. We can understand them in the context of their time and place. We can understand them for what they are. We can listen to the communities that created them and that continue to hold them and transmit them and try to understand what it means to them. And in other words, all this boils down to, we can use these texts as a way, not just to understand the clockwork of our minds, but to use it to understand the world we live in, the places, and also each other, communities that we might not be a part of. And that, I think, is a much better approach to mythology than what Joseph Campbell gave us. So there it is. That's my screed against Joseph Campbell. I welcome your questions.